everyone. Welcome to the Center for Creative Leadership webinar, Assessment Challenge Support, CCL's Framework for Contextualizing Collegiate Leadership Development, presented by Todd Deal and Preston Yarborough of the Center for Creative Leadership. I'm Michelle Bryan, your CCL event host. If you're just getting to know us, CCL is a top-ranked provider of executive education globally. We work with two-thirds of the world's top 500 organizations, providing innovative solutions for the entire organization and programs proven to transform the individual. Our work is based on significant research from our own elite teams to the finest global sources, and we share it readily with you today in this discussion. Before our presenters begin, please know we love participation and invite you to use the chat tools provided on the right side of your screen to ask questions, interact with presenters. Simply direct your chat to all panelists or all participants. A more formal Q&A session will be held at the end of the webinar. Finally, look for a link to the recorded version in your inbox tomorrow. I'm pleased to have with us today Todd Deal, Senior Faculty and Director of the Higher Ed Practice at CCL, and Preston Yarborough, Senior Faculty of the Higher Ed Practice at CCL. Welcome, Todd and Preston, and I'll now turn the session over to you, Todd.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome. We are delighted to have you all with us today at the start of this new academic semester for those of you in a college or university space. My name is Todd Deal, and I have the privilege of serving in the higher ed practice at the Center for Creative Leadership, where I've been for almost 2 years now after a 30-year career in higher ed, where I was faculty member, spent some time as an administrator, as well as led a student leadership development program at the university where I served. Preston?
Yes, and my name is Preston Yarborough. I'm the one that doesn't sound like he works in radio. And I work with Todd in the higher ed practice. I am a senior faculty member and have been at the center now for 9 years. And prior to that was at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, running a leadership program there for roughly 7 years prior to this. So between our combined experience, we've got, I guess, a little more years than we would have thought when we add it all up there.
40 or 50 or so or something like that. So we're glad to have you all with us today. And our time together, we'll spend a little bit of time explaining what we refer to as the ACS model, the Assessment, Challenge, and Support model, that based on our research here at the Center for Creative Leadership, and then talk about how to use the ACS model as a developmental framework, both for your program as well as your students. And then my little play on do what you say you will do down there. Are we doing what we say we are? So how do we know in using the Assessment Challenge Support model and developing student leaders that we're doing what we say we are? And we'll finish up with just a brief mention about bringing leadership to life in your context. And throughout our conversation today, that's really what we want to talk about, is how we bring leadership development programs to life for college students.
So to go ahead and jump into a core piece of information that we'll build on today, we are going to be talking about the Assessment, Challenge, and Support model that is a way of thinking about how to create developmental experiences that have lasting impact. So in a few moments, we're going to talk a little bit more about each assessment, challenge, and support, and how those relate to generating results with whomever you're working with. But in this case, we're talking about it as it relates to college students.
Mm-hmm. So for assessment, what we mean by that is not necessarily a formal assessment, and we'll talk more about as we go through. But as you can see here, it helps us sort of set the stage and measure a person, a situation, the environmental factors. It gives us that starting place to help someone understand where their developmental areas might be. What are their leadership strengths? What are their preferences? And we suggest that throughout a leadership development experience, there's this ongoing self-evaluation. And I like the language we use to help unfreeze those present perceptions, recognizing those, where you are now and what your strengths are now, that you can grow in those, because we very much work on the philosophy that leadership is something that you can develop and that can be taught to students.
And I'm going to go ahead and reinforce something that Todd opened up with when we were talking about assessment, and it's that idea that there are a range of different ways to approach assessment. And we can think about one end of the continuum as being a pretty informal way of approaching assessment, and another end of the continuum being a very formal, instrumental way of providing assessment. And we see value throughout that entire continuum. And we think any valuable, broad development experience is going to include different aspects of assessment in it. But we just wanted to make sure that we all had a common understanding of assessments, that idea of getting a sense of where we are now, and then maybe that helps us think a little bit about where we might want to go in the future, because having that sort of baseline idea of where we are and that benchmark of where we want to go can help frame the developmental experience.
And I think, Preston, later on you're going to give us an example of both an informal and a formal assessment and how we can use those.
Absolutely. So next what we're talking about is challenge. And challenge is a developmental experience that prompts someone to step out of their comfort zone and consider new ways to solve problems, new ways to think, ways to understand others, and expand someone's understanding and practice of leadership. Basically, a developmental challenge, one that truly has developmental challenge, will not be able to be solved with the existing skills that someone walks in with or the existing knowledge that they walk in with. It's going to create what we'll call disequilibrium. It's going to create a sense of, ooh, something needs to happen here in order for this to be able to work out the way we want it to. And so it will demand skills and abilities beyond somebody's current scope.
And those, when we frame challenges, Preston, you know, we often talk about framing a challenge for a freshman is quite a bit different than framing a challenge, say, for a senior who's about to step into the workplace or to graduate school. We all remember being freshmen, and just entering college itself can be a challenge. And so the scope of a challenge for a freshman may seem somewhat less, but it is that piece that you said I think is so important, creating that disequilibrium. It takes just a little bit to create that, whereas maybe for a senior it takes some more.
And before we move on, one of the things, you know, in the title of this, we talk about contextualizing leadership development. Challenge is one of the key areas where we can really contextualize someone's development experience. We'll talk more about that a little bit later, but just want to say that the type of challenge that you have and making it directly relevant to someone's experience, especially for a college student, if there's a degree of urgency that they have as it relates to trying to accomplish that challenge, it's going to help them immerse themselves more in the development experience than if it's something that just feels like it's just been created just because. But if it's a challenge that they really buy into and are committed to, it creates so much more developmental value than if it isn't.
Yeah. And then the third piece of the model, support, makes up those relationships and resources to help students or to help those being developed walk through those leadership challenge. It can be as simple as encouraging one's willingness to stretch beyond the boundaries and that, if you will, cheer them on, something to help them maintain their motivation to develop. And the support piece requires or validates that required learning and effort that you're continuing to go through. And we've seen students before in our own lives, and we've experienced that challenge just seems to go on, and after a while you just feel like you're not making progress or you feel like you're stuck. But that's when all of a sudden you hit that gray swamp of despair, if you will, when you begin to come back out the other side. And just that little encouragement to keep us moving forward is a great part of support.
And another piece of support that often gets overlooked or isn't maybe given its fair share that I'll briefly mention here is the idea of resources.
Yeah.
So sometimes a thing related to support is just providing, for example, the time to be able to get something done, or providing enough access to resources to address whatever that challenge is. And depending on what the challenge is, the types of resources necessary or support necessary is going to shift. I mean, common sense would tell us that, but we need to be mindful of that as we're working with different learners in different contexts. The way we show up for them and the way we provide support for them might also need to shift. And so that's one of the things that is you're assessing your own ability and consistency of providing support, that's a good element to keep in, or a good aspect to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, for sure. So how do we use the assessment, challenge, and support model to promote what we call intentional contextualized development? Let me take a moment. Preston mentioned earlier the importance of contextualized. What we're thinking about here is not taking maybe the latest airport bookshop leadership theory or principle and applying it to college students. Instead, taking it into their context and creating that, I like the word you used, urgency, that this leadership development piece and the journey that they're going through is not simply an add-on or something extra, but it is a part of their college education, and it fits the context, whether that context is they're parts of a sports team or a member of a student organization, or even in their labs that they work in and how they serve as leaders in the labs, to take the leadership development experience that they are walking through and to bring that to life in their context.
I'll give a really quick example of an experience that we learned from that'll just take me a moment to share, but it might resonate for some folks. So I was working with a university that had an engineering program, and they have a first-year design experience that they would put students through. And when we originally when we originally went in and did some initial work, we created a leadership development kind of mini seminar type thing that they did at the beginning of this experience. And then they went in and immersed themselves in their lab, and we were hoping they would transfer what they learned at the beginning of the semester into the practice that they were using as they moved throughout the rest of the semester. And what we found was mentally, they felt like these were two different things. They almost felt like, okay, well, we did that leadership stuff in the beginning, but then we got onto the real work of the class later on. And there wasn't a great transfer between the first part and the second part. However, when we contextualized it, what we ended up doing was creating a curriculum where the leadership development was embedded within the teaching of the course, such that they would get insights and things like that periodically throughout the semester, and then they would practice those when they were working on their groups and teams. Then they would reflect on how that process worked, and then they would use what they learned from that into the next phase of their class. And what we did was we created a contextualized example where what they were learning from a leadership perspective was vital for them to be able to produce whatever their academic outcomes were for the course. And in that way, that's a very clear example, but we're just trying to say that contextualization means that it feels like it's an immersed part of that student's experience as opposed to some extra thing that they go to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example to use. So what we'll do is sort of walk you through how to create an ACS program matrix, and Preston will show you how to do that quickly. And then we'll look at your program and determine where those assessment, challenge, and support elements show up within the program components, and then talk a little bit about what we might do to enhance ACS within your program elements. Preston?
Yeah, so, we use this big fancy word like, create an ACS program matrix. And I just want to tell you, when I usually do this, it's not on a formal spreadsheet or something like that. What we'll actually do is we'll huddle together with whomever I'm working with. And what we'll do is we'll get a flip chart or a whiteboard, and on that flip chart or whiteboard down the left-hand column, we'll identify what are the program elements that students are going through. What is it that they have access to? It doesn't mean that every student goes through every single piece of that, but these are the things that are available to them. What we've done here is we've created one that Todd and I kind of pieced together from different leadership programs that we've been in parts of. This isn't any one program. In actuality, it's a fictional thing, but it represents what a lot of leadership programs might look like in a first-year program. And so what you'll see is first we have some workshops. The first three comprise workshops. Then we have a speaker series that they can go hear a speaker, some type of multicultural experience, and then maybe there's a high or low ropes course program that a student could go through. Maybe they're part of a reading group with 5 dysfunctions of a team. Then down below you can see there's some more curricular-oriented things where they might be involved in a community service project or trip, co-lead a community service project or trip, participate in a service learning class, and then, of course, they're going to submit whatever packet they need to submit for their requirements of the year. or for the credits of the program. But what we have you do is list each of those, and then what we'll do is create some columns on this spreadsheet or on this flip chart, one column for assessment, one column for challenge, and one column for support. And then what we'll do, Todd, if you'll go ahead and advance, what we'll do is go through and think very objectively about how well we actually address each of these elements within the program offering. So, for example, do we have, in this What is Leadership workshop, well, maybe that's a pretty theoretical workshop that's introducing the concepts of leadership, leadership theory and who studies it and why it's important and all that kind of stuff. But maybe we don't include, assessment there. And so there's an N there, and it's a red mark just to recognize that, that's not something we're dealing with. Do we have a challenge incorporated into it? No, not really. And is there a support piece? Well, if you don't have a challenge piece, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a support piece there. So there, we have N's across the board. Now, you can see as we continue moving through this, Todd, and we'll just go through the rest of our programs, and we'll see that, there may be quite a few areas here where we might want to be more intentional about whether or not we're incorporating an assessment element in there, a challenge element in there, or a support element in there. Now, I want to say before we move on, the idea isn't that every single one of these boxes has a Y and is green. That's not realistic. It's not the expectation. But what we would hope for is that we would have a nice kind of, as a student journeys through these experiences, we would have enough assessment, challenge, and support spread out through these different experiences that on the whole, they would get a meaningful development experience. Anything you would?
Yeah, and Preston and I were talking, we reviewed the participant list and noticed that some of you are not necessarily in a college or university context. This works just as well with a professional development experience. If you're doing internships with students, or if you work at a company and you're supervising interns and want to provide, you can do this exact same thing. The key is just finding your program elements, right, and what the different journey you're having the participants walk through, and then looking at assessment, challenge, and support along the way.
And before you move ahead, there's one other thing that I'll mention, and that is there can be a lot of value in something that doesn't necessarily provide assessment, challenge, and support. So, for example, a speaker series. There's not going to be a speaker series where you're really likely to get assessment, challenge, and support in there, but there is something that somebody might hear from a speaker or inspiration that they might get from a speaker that can certainly have meaningful developmental value. So we just want to make sure we're not giving the impression that if it doesn't have assessment, challenge, and support that it's not valuable. A lot of these things do, but what often happens is we will get into a curriculum that we'll build or some type of developmental experiences that we build and just not realize that we haven't taken time to build these elements in there, and we're not getting as much developmental value out of that as we could.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so you want to walk us through, let's take these first three maybe, and say how might we look at assessment, challenge, and support in there and what we would do.
Right, so we're just going to take a deeper dive into these workshop elements here, and we'll just take so what we'll do next after we've maybe identified that these require some additional time and energy. Notice we can't necessarily fix everything all at once, so what we're going to do is maybe concentrate in a specific area and see what can we do to really enhance that aspect. And so here we're looking at the what is leadership experience that I was talking about earlier, and if you'll notice, we have 3 red ends across the top. So then the next row below says, what possible changes can we make to contextualize and enhance development? So one thing that we might do from an assessment perspective is, what if we were to use a Visual Explorer, which is a tool that the Center for Creative Leadership has that uses images, and those images can often be used to help spark meaningful types of conversations. And so these images are of sometimes pastoral scenes, sometimes it's a busy city, sometimes it's a macro image of like a piece of fruit or something like that, but they're all really compelling and interesting. Well, what we could do is use a deck of images like that and have a student find one that helps them create a personal definition of leadership. So they find an image that might represent what leadership means to them, and then they'll have a conversation with some folks at a table, and then maybe they'll jot down a brief journal entry or something like that to say, hey, this is what leadership means to me. So now that's not a formal assessment, but it helps to clarify something, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time for us to do that, and it's a pretty cool experience for them as well. Then if we're looking at challenge, one thing they might do is, from a challenge perspective, is keep a weekly journal for 1 month to document when your actions did or did not align with your definition of leadership. So there we're asking them to reflect more deeply about how much their philosophy of leadership is showing up through their actions over a period of time. And then here we're going to talk about support maybe a little bit differently than it being directly connected to this challenge. But one of the things you could do in a first-year program would be convene a mid-semester pizza party where first years can review journals and talk about what's worked and not worked about the semester. And, you know, the emphasis here is food and fellowship. And then we'll have them just, you know, after they've been hanging out for a little bit, we might have them talk a little bit about what are some of the things that have gone well, what are some of the things that were different than you expected, but just get them comfortable with the idea that they can talk about both their successes and their challenges in this particular setting and know that they're going to be supported. So that then when they're getting into more challenging things, they know that they have a place. We're setting that norm for them right out of the gate. Todd, what would you add there?
You know, when you talked about assessment, Preston, I often think of us as collegiate educators. You know, we're trying to assess our students' learning. And what you described with the Visual Explorer there, you know, at the beginning of the semester, you have the students write their personal definition with a Visual Explorer. Think about maybe if this is a workshop series, in the last workshop, you revisit leadership and have them go through that exercise again is a really nice way to see how their learning has progressed or changed over the course of a semester. So you can use it as more of a student learning assessment as well.
Absolutely. So now we'll talk about a little bit different type of example. First one was this theoretical thing sort of about what is leadership, and now we're moving into maybe an introduction to personality. And we're using, in this case, at least at some of the programs I've done in the past, we've used the MBTI as a nice tool to just have a conversation about what personality is. It's very introductory, right? And so we have that assessment already built into the program. But then is there, you know, what is it that we can do to give them a challenge as they're walking away? We're not asking them to change their personality. That's not really what we're talking about here. I mean, that is what it is. But one of the challenges that we could ask them is to maybe get another person's perspective on them and how they see themselves, you know. And so maybe a challenge there might be to find, you know, of course, just a trusted friend or family member, someone they feel safe with, but to share their report with that person and see what areas they see that kind of match up and seem consistent with their experience of the individual versus things that don't, because sometimes our self-understanding is maybe a little bit different than what somebody else sees. But then they can have the challenges to have a conversation with them so that they get a better perspective from somebody else's point of view of themselves. And then the support piece from a personality frame would be maybe convene a follow-up personality session just prior to exams that helps students understand their personalities when they're under stress and strategies they can use when they're in the grip. So it's one of those things that, again, when we talk about urgency and relevance, when somebody is going through something or is anticipating something that's coming up, and then you provide them some information about themselves that lines up with what they're seeing with their friends and what they're experiencing for themselves, that sticks more than if it's just this theoretical thing that we're talking about when nothing else is going on. So sometimes you can use the context that you're in to set up some really interesting learning experiences.
I think contextualizing that in their lives, and that is connecting with your students, understanding where they are and how to put that in there, that is, I don't know, I hesitate to use the term, but it's the magic that makes leadership development stick in that moment.
It's the kind of thing that for me, when I would realize something like this was successful, it often wasn't in the moment when we were actually doing the thing, but I'd have students come up to me a year later, or I bump into them in the airport or something like that, and they'll say, you know, when you had us do this thing, and that's what happened was we planted a seed, and all of a sudden, you know, some water came across there, a little bit of fertilizer, and then it sprouted up, and that's when they realized how all these pieces fit together. But when you do these kinds of things like this, it helps to add fertilizer to it so that sprouting, you just increase the chances for that to happen.
And before we leave this, I want to emphasize again what Preston said before. You know, if we take the first one up at the top, the what is leadership, there are possible changes all the way across. It is not necessary to go and change every single piece that it becomes yes, yes, yes. Maybe the assessment is enough, and you do that one, or maybe you want to do the assessment and the challenge and then add in the support. How you change those over the course of your program to make sure that you have enough yeses, and what is that percentage? There is no magic formula. There is no number necessary, but you understand in your context what your students need in order to help them grow.
And one that often gets overlooked, just in the numbers of times I've done this with our partners, one of the things that gets overlooked, believe it or not, is support. And it's not because support isn't something, I mean, I'm often working with student affairs where support's a big part of what they do.
Right.
But it's not necessarily support with intention. It's that we have this resource available, but we haven't thought about how we shape that in a way that can be maybe a little bit more meaningful. So we do a pizza party, but we don't necessarily think about how we can tie that into something else that we're doing. Or, you know, so how do you just think about small changes that you can make that can add value?
Yeah, absolutely. So then when we think about, we're doing this great program, we've built it, now we've added in elements throughout, and we see yeses populated, feeling very strongly about the program that we've created. How do we know that we are doing or developing what it is that we say that we are doing? And so at CCL, we have a research-based tool that we use with our clients called the Leadership Indicator for Students, and we have a college version of that. And the Leadership Indicator for Students is based on our CCL Student Leadership Framework, which is 3 broad areas. You want to jump in?
Well, go ahead and explain the 3 areas, and then I'll...
3 areas very much leading yourself, leading with others, and changing your world. Having developed a student leadership program myself, and I know Preston has as well, those are fairly typical. And in the work we do with adults, oftentimes we think about the same areas. But that self being a deep understanding of who you are and awareness of your own behavior, working with others, teamwork, how to work effectively and leading with others. And then changing your world is very much about being a change agent and how you step into a larger context to do something that's important.
So speaking of these elements here that we're looking at, one of the things that I think is important to share is this particular tool was not adapted from an adult or professional focused tool. This was actually developed with younger people, understanding how they conceptualize leadership, what are the themes and practices that help us understand leadership from their point of view, and then developmentally, how do we frame those so that what we are creating is something that is valid for younger populations. And so we have validated this both with K through 12 students as well as college students. And interestingly enough, because these are foundational concepts for leadership development, we found that they were equally valid for adults as well. So actually, as we've gone through here, we really learned some interesting things. But I wanted to make sure everybody understood that this is validated and is very much from the youth's perspective, not from the adult's perspective, but it holds up regardless of what the population is. One other thing that I think could be good to be mindful of here is this idea of when we are providing a leadership development experience, it's impossible to be able to do everything for everybody. So you have to be able to make some choices about where are we going to invest our time, where are we going to invest, where are we going to focus. And a tool like this can help you make some very critical decisions about where to put your time and energy so that you can get the results that you're hoping for at the end of the year.
Yeah, and you're going to walk us through that with the heat map and talk about gaps that we have. So, and I think it's so important, Preston. It's one of the things that before coming to the center I really appreciated so much is that the leadership development content is research-based.
Yeah.
We have a faculty of research scientists based here in our Greensboro office for the most part who are daily digging into the world of leadership development and researching these concepts. So I find that a rewarding part to be, or a rewarding piece of the center, and I get to be a part of that. So when we talk about each of the 3 areas, they have attributes that align with each of the 3 areas. And you see the attributes here for leading self and those with leading others and changing your world. 14 attributes we've found that are related to each of those, and this next list will show you that those attributes, take leading self for instance, one that is resilient, a student who's resilient keeps trying if they fail at an important goal. Or in the leading for others, someone who's considerate, thinks about how their actions make other people feel. and in changing your world, motivating, unites a group of people to work together towards a common goal. Now, when we think about attributes, oftentimes in the adult world, we talk about competencies. These we purposefully call attributes and not competencies. And because a competency is very much a behavioral-based concept that is related to a job or a job performance skill, where these attributes are purposefully much broader in terms of that.
There can be a behavioral skill with them,
Sure there can.
but they also can extend beyond that. And we felt like it was important to distinguish between the idea of what a competency technically is versus something that might include aspects of competence in it, but also includes other aspects. Because if you think about a student's environment, it's very different than what we have in a professional workplace. For a competency, we can do a study on what a particular job is, what are the skills necessary to succeed in that job, and that's how we identify competencies, right? But when you're talking about a student, their experience is so fluid. They're in this class for this particular time with this particular set of responsibilities, or they're part of this student group one year, but then the next year they have a different role in that student group. So things are constantly changing, and it's important to recognize that because of that fluidity, we need to also have a tool that recognizes and appreciates that fluidity, hence the term attribute and our approach through attributes versus competencies.
Yeah, because as our colleagues, you can imagine that the competencies that a student needs, while you may think of some that would translate across the 4 years, they certainly develop over the 4 years. And so calling them attributes, I so much appreciated when I was first learning about the leadership indicator for students, that the reason that they're attributes is that fluidity of a student's environment and how important that is to make this tool recognize and represent that fluidity.
Yes. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to share a little bit about the kind of information that is provided on the LIS report. And I will let you know, first of all, the first two we're going to look at pretty quickly. So where you see perceived value of dimensions by observer role and leadership attribute scores by observer role, we're going to touch on those pretty briefly. We're going to spend a little bit more time on the leadership attribute heat map. But because those first two kind of contribute to the leadership, the data in the leadership attribute heat map, I wanted to touch on those. So another thing you may notice is we're talking about observer roles. So a lot of
almost sounds like a 360, Preston.
Yeah,
Are we doing a 360?
It's not a 360, but it's one of the. It doesn't rely strictly on self-report because self-reported data is not quite as reliable as observer-reported data. So why don't we go ahead and move on, and some of this will start to become a little bit more clear. So first of all, one of the things we wanted to do was to look at the perceived value of the different dimensions of the framework. So perceived value of leading self, leading with others, changing your world by observer role. Why is this important? Well, when we think about it, if you'll look to the right side of this graph here, and you'll see down in the bottom right corner of the legend, we have a student, teacher, and administrator roles. So we have students that are completing this, the instructor that is completing this, and administrators within an institution can also complete this as it relates to their perception of students. And the reason this can be valuable is we often find that there's a discrepancy between what a student might think is as important versus what a teacher might think is important versus what an administrator thinks is important. And when we think about evaluations and stuff like that, this can help give us an idea of what other folks, other stakeholders in the system think about what is important, what is a priority. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to change everything because of that, but it certainly can help you think more strategically about the program that you're developing and what you're reporting about the program that you're developing.
And those roles, Preston, are not strictly defined. So if I had a program coordinator instead of a teacher, we could do that as a program coordinator in that role.
Yeah, or maybe an administrator might be a program coordinator, but if you had somebody who was facilitating or doing something in front of students, they certainly could be considered an instructor.
Okay.
They would be observing these, students as they're going through whatever it is. Therefore, they have an ability to provide that perspective.
Got it.
So now what we're looking at is the leadership attribute scores by observer roles. So these are the different the different observers that are captured within this particular process. So first we have all. That includes everyone. Then we have all observers. So that's everybody except for self-ratings. Then we have self-ratings, we have peer ratings, and we have instructor ratings. So we bring this up to simply say, hey, these are the different perspectives. And as we were talking earlier about self-report, if you look down the self column, you'll notice that those scores are higher consistently than everybody else's scores. So what we see is what we often see in leadership development is people on average think that they're above average. and that's a paradox. You can't, on average, be above average. So what happens is we have peer scores, we have instructor scores, and things like that to help us get a little bit more realistic view. And then that helps us, again, think more strategically about how things are going, how things are working out.
I found it very interesting that the peer scores and the instructor scores are very much the same.
Yes.
And are lower, by and large, than the self scores.
Yes, yes. And so that's helpful, and it's just good to know that, basically,
for sure.
right?
For sure.
Okay, so now what we're going to talk about now is maybe the more valuable piece of information here, the leadership attribute heat map. So if we'll go ahead and advance this just a little bit. So what we're going to first be doing is we're going to be creating a matrix, and on the vertical axis of the matrix, we're going to be looking at the skill in applying an attribute. And on the horizontal axis, what we're going to be looking at is the importance of that attribute. So earlier when we were talking about, hey, is leading self-important? Is, changing your world important? So we can create now a 4-box matrix by cross-referencing these two particular sources of information. So that up in the top left corner, if we have a high skill in something but low importance, then we can consider that a reserve. It's something that we're good at, but it's not something that's particularly important. So it's nice to have, but it's not critical. Here in the asset side, we have something where we have high skill with an attribute, and it's also important. And so that's really important. And those are assets. So if we're scoring high in that area, that's something that is important and we're already good at, which is nice to know. Now we can look in this bottom left corner, and we have low skill and low importance. So those are developmental assets. So if we could get better at it, that might be good, but those are not particularly areas that are high priority areas for us to focus on. So then when we get to the right corner, what we have is low skill, high importance, and those are our key gaps. So when we talk about investing time and energy into curriculum development and things like that, the stuff that shows up in this low skill, high importance area would be an important area to focus on. And that really gives us a sense of maybe where we might want to place our bets with regard to upcoming curriculum, time and effort, and resources.
And maybe even to go back to the ACS matrix that we looked at.
Perfect.
And say, where can we ramp this up?
Right. So that's a great example, whereas, you can't do everything everywhere all the time. You go back to the ACS matrix and you look at the programming that you have that might relate to areas that are down in this quadrant here, and say, oh, okay, that's what we're really going to analyze right now through assessment, challenge, and support, and help us think through what we might redevelop.
All right. So let's look at a matrix as an example.
So what we do is we have, so now you can notice that we have these attributes, and these attributes are plotted based on, this is from sample data, and the attributes are plotted based on, whether they're a reserve, an asset, a developmental asset, or a key gap. And so you can see that in this particular case, maybe some of the things that we need to focus on, good listener and communicative are right there together. Those are really important, especially if we want to have good group work together in our, if they're working on project teams and things like that. If we want to be able to have good leaders within other areas of the school, for example, student government and things like that, those are all areas where we might want to focus in on. And what we can do is now use that to drill down more deeply on other areas that we have that could support that. Anything you'd add there, Todd?
Yeah, I think if you notice kind of what happens there, a couple of those come out of leading with others, a couple of those leading with self, and one in the changing your world. So where to focus that piece of improving your program. This provides a guide to think about what we might do there.
And another thing that becomes interesting to me here, and I don't know, I might be diving into the weeds a little bit, but it's not necessary to come up with a particular program to focus on good listener or a particular program to focus on communicative necessarily. You might already have initiatives that are going on that will suit those, But what you're going to do is in your reflections on that, or in the debriefing that you're doing from those experiences, you'll really want to focus in on making sure that students are understanding how they've been using those particular skills as it relates to that particular activity. In other words, don't let that learning opportunity pass by without investing a little bit of time to help make this stick a little bit more.
Yeah.
And when you're creating assignments or things like that that they need to turn in for credits and things like that, you can focus those assignments in these particular directions so that that becomes a red thread that's kind of a theme that might go throughout your programming. So it isn't necessary to create a specific program for each of these attributes. Just think about how each of these attributes can be focused on in programming you already have.
Yeah. And I know, Preston, one of the groups that we're working with, one of the institutions we're working with now, is using the leadership indicator for students as kind of a pre and post. Can you talk for just a second about using the LIS in that way?
So I'm glad you brought that up because it was something we didn't mention necessarily, we might not have mentioned clearly earlier, is that this is not an instrument that is an individual instrument. In other words, a student doesn't take this and get an individualized feedback report on what they had to say. This is actually an institutional instrument. So you use this for your whole program, and you get a sense of kind of what the snapshot is of your program at the beginning. And then if you want to go through the end of the year, you can do a second snapshot and get a chance to see sort of how things look after the fact. So if you have new students coming in and you take a snapshot of them at the beginning, and then they go through a year's worth of programming and you look at them at the end, you can get a sense maybe of how, it's not, you can't necessarily attribute everything to your programming, but you can see how they've been progressing from point A to point B. The other thing you can do is over time, if you're trying to create meaningful changes in certain outcomes within your program, and if you have something that's in a key gap area in the beginning, but you've done some curriculum changes, and now you go back and you look at this a few years later, you can start to see if you're moving the needle on those particular attributes because of the curriculum changes that you might have made. So there are ways that or at least you can start to make that as a hypothesis. You may not be able to directly attribute it, but you're at least getting a sense of whether or not the needle's moving on that particular, learning for that particular attribute.
Yeah. And I don't want to bring up the nasty word of accreditation, but when your accreditors are coming around and you say you're doing a certain type of development, and you can show this sort of data, it becomes really valuable data to have that, okay, there's not cause and effect, but we're trying to improve our students' listening skills or the communication, and we can show data that shows that that is in fact happening.
Right.
Becomes a feather in your cap.
And and the report that we have, and you can on our site we have it. You can download a sample report to see what it looks like. We provide discussion questions and things like that in there for you and fellow staff members to talk through. We also can provide consultation with you on it. It just depends on sort of what's most helpful for you. Is it something you want to sort of do independently? Is it something that you would want to do in collaboration with us? But we have developed this tool to be able to be used independently, but we certainly collaborate with lots of our partners as well.
Yeah, for sure. So that last part of bringing the leadership to life, to say that these relevant experiences are key, absolutely. When Preston talked about earlier of the program he worked with and integrating that into a curriculum, and not all of us have that opportunity to integrate it into a curriculum, but finding those places that you can integrate leadership development in a way that it's not an add-on, it's not a side piece, but it's a part of the student's experience. And how we do that, we have the 70-20-10 rule for leadership development that we talk about. And while those numbers are not meant to be steadfast numbers, they give us a broad idea that 10% of leadership development really comes from formal instruction. Those of us who spend our lives in the classroom feel kind of bad about that number, but the truth of the matter is our students learn the concepts, but then taking it and putting it into practice is when it really gets driven home. 20% is those other people, the developmental relationships that advance learning, and that may be things like leadership coaching, mentoring, peer coaching, where we've run some programs in peer coaching to support students in their leadership development. And then the 70% application, where things like volunteering or leadership focused small group projects curricular integration that we talked about before, or even using these in your chemistry lab group and understanding how your lab team works together and who's playing what role, or how you use those leadership development concepts in that role. So that 70-20-10 rule, thinking about that and making leadership development contextualized and relevant through meaningful experiences. I didn't throw in there, but internships is another one that can bring those sort of experiences to life. I see we have quite a few questions coming in, so anything to add before we jump in?
I think let's go ahead and address questions, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so chat your questions to Todd and Preston to all panelists and all participants in the chat function. We do have a couple coming in. First one, what suggestions or tips do you have for motivating students to practice behaviors related to a developmental challenge?
So we start with the easy ones. Motivating students to practice behaviors related to a developmental challenge is very much putting it in their context. How can it benefit them? And I think of some of the organizations that we've worked with before, and we've actually surveyed students to say, how do we make leadership development come to life? And one of the things that was interesting with one of our current partners, the students told us, make it career-focused. They're a very career-driven and career-focused sorts of institution. And sure enough, when we do couch the leadership development in, though this will help you in your job in this way, or if you're thinking about that job in this way, the students were much more open to that and to hear what we had to say.
Yeah, I would also, so first of all, I'm going to mention that I see that David Day asked, I think he asked that question.
Mm-hmm.
David, I've been a big fan of your work for many years, and thank you for your thinking there. So what I'd like to mention here, I think that's where that challenge piece comes in, and it becomes really important. When a student is able to identify, or you help them identify a challenge that's meaningful to them, the motivation for behavioral change is greater than if that challenge doesn't feel particularly relevant for them. In other words, I'd say the secret probably lies in the ambition of the challenge itself than trying to convince them to do a certain behavior differently. And then the secret, or at least the kind of the secret in the sauce, if you will, is creating conditions where you collectively, I mean you and the students together, can sort of figure out what those challenges are and what they need to be. Sometimes they can come in with it really clear, and that's no problem. There are other students that are a lot less clear on that. But things like value sorts and things like that to help identify what values are important to them, and being very strategic in some of the ways that you might create a sort of foundation of self-awareness to then help get better at thinking about what motivates me and why I care about it also can contribute there. So some of those auxiliary things I think help, and it's not so much a one moment that we figure it out, but whether collectively over time, how do we get greater clarity around what's important, and then how do we support them as they continue moving toward that behavior change.
Yeah, so you mentioned support. Preston, I'd love to hear your thoughts on over-supporting. You know, as a parent and as a collegiate educator, I often found myself in the place of rescuing the folks that I was trying to support. So completing the challenge for them, or making the challenge simpler and not letting them struggle through that. Seems to me it's possible to over-support.
Absolutely. I mean, the struggle needs to be real. The struggle should be, and it isn't. So often, students will think that a successful result is the sign of success. And oftentimes, you can have more developmental impact through a result that isn't necessarily what they were hoping for than just if they accomplish it. We think about that with experiential learning when we create, these experiential activities in a program. Sometimes we, as facilitators, want them to succeed because they're going to be excited about that. But the reality is often greater learning comes when they struggle with that more. But then it's time for us to be good educators and help them learn from the experience of their struggle. So that, I think, becomes the more important support piece, is how do we help facilitate their insights from whatever they're going through.
So hold them in the heat of that moment.
Yeah.
And that is a supportive thing to do.
Yeah.
So. Other questions, Michelle?
That goes into a comment. Students today are motivated by challenge and teamwork in competitions, and they also asked at what age can leadership traits be discovered?
That was one of the most interesting things. I was part of the team that helped develop the LIS, and it was amazing to be working with second graders and hearing them describe what leadership looks like in their grade. And so actually, the word discovered can mean two different things. It can mean how do we see it in other people, but also how do we see it within ourselves. And so what's interesting is when you start to have these conversations with younger people at earlier ages in a way that matches with their life experience, they can start to identify leadership and talk about it in really interesting ways, even as young as like second grade.
That's 7 years old.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's pretty phenomenal, and it's out there. It's just a matter of us rewiring ourselves to be aware that that capability is there.
Great. Got a couple more coming in. How have you utilized leadership assessments in corporate summer internship programs? Got a lot of questions coming in about internships here.
So I assume that means internship programs for college students. And I don't know that we have worked particularly, well, we do. There's a couple of programs here in our local area that we have used those leadership assessments with. And we've used some formal assessments, but the one that Preston described earlier in helping using the Visual Explorer to help students define leadership or talk about, create their own personal definition of leadership. And then as the summer progresses, watching students grow into that, we've definitely used that in the summer internship experiences. I don't know if that's what the question was driving at or not.
I'll mention too, I think this is from Jody. And Jody, another thing that I have found that's helpful is sometimes using like less formal tools for assessment with internships. So not so much like a personality instrument or something like that, though that can be helpful. But like we created one called a workplace navigator tool. And basically it was a tool that kind of helped young people going into an internship start to become more aware of the culture of the environment they're in, expectations within that culture, how that matches up with what they were thinking before they went in there, and just it helps to make some of that more explicit so that they can have a more intentional reflection on it. So that's another way that we use assessments, is to generate maybe greater insight between, some things that maybe are happening beneath the surface but we're not consciously aware of.
Yeah.
But for example, when they walk into the lobby, what do they see? What does that tell you about the organization that you're walking into? What do they value? What do they prioritize? And thinking about that as it relates to, and now what's it like when you get into a work team, and how do some of those values show up within your work team? So it's some of those types of tools we find to be helpful.
Great. Another one from Mary Ann, lead a nonprofit that provides internships. Do you have a link to a report or study that I can share with my board to show how I'm following your recommendations into our internships?
Yeah, and Mary Ann, that's a great question. You will actually get a follow-up email tomorrow that will have a white paper that Preston and I and our higher ed leadership team have put together with kind of 5 keys to success, or 5 key practices for student leadership development, collegiate student leadership development, that I think you'll find helpful in that. So that'll come in tomorrow's email, right, Michelle?
Yep, that'll go out tomorrow. Another one coming in from Allison. I'm interested in developing a co-curricular transcript for students on leadership, cultural competencies, etc. Can you provide any advice?
So one of the things, I would say that potentially one of the areas that could be helpful would be to look at something like the leadership indicator for students and look at the attributes in there, because that can, in the framework that we introduced here to you today, because that can give you a bit of a framework to help to speak to what you're talking about. So, any good framework has handles that can give access to specific things that branch off of it. So we may not talk about cultural competence specifically within the framework, but there are attributes within that framework that certainly contribute to cultural competence. So using that maybe as a way of helping to, create a bit of an assessment process, or at least a protocol for thinking about certain aspects. Those are the ones that we found that were most developmentally relevant for young people.
And I'll go back, and hello, Allison. It's good to hear from you. Developing the co-curricular transcript, especially thinking about in terms of leadership, my piece of advice there would, for it to be structured, that it's not necessarily a smorgasbord where we pick an activity here or pick an event there, but as you develop this co-curricular transcript, to put some intentionality into it, that you do have a framework, as Preston mentioned, and ours that we suggest, leading self, leading with others, and changing your world, is that purposeful, intentional, developmental trajectory for students to walk through. Because as we all know, if a student wants a co-curricular transcript and you put a smorgasbord out there, just like the rest of us, what's the path of least resistance? How can I find the easiest things to make my way to that co-curricular transcript? And I'm not suggesting that we make it more difficult for students. I'm simply suggesting that we make it intentional in terms of the activities that we set out for them and ask them to participate in.
Yeah, just to build on that, Todd, one of the things, if I'm thinking about a co-curricular transcript or something like that, in my mind I'm trying to think about what's the learning journey that the student's going to go on. And as I'm now thinking about the learning journey, well, what would be core elements on the front end of that learning journey that could be important? What would be some things that are a little bit more advanced as they get further on in there that could be valuable? And then what's the capstone potentially that would be really meaningful? So if I got that arc in mind now, then that's where you can go back and use a tool like assessment, challenge, and support to think about those different pieces that you have on the arc and see whether or not you feel like you've got a nice, developmental sort of range of experiences in there for them. And that maybe could help to some degree as you think about having a transcript that really has more impact. Because you can create a transcript that may not have as much developmental impact. It can still be good, but if you help to do a little bit of that auditing and a little bit of to what degree you can maybe influence some of the curriculum in there, that might help.
And what's your vision? Where do you want to take them?
Yep.
Yeah, to understand that.
So we probably have time for one or two more. Michael says, any research you can share on the value of leadership skills on career advancements, often one of the soft skills cited by employers as a need to have or nice to have for new hires. Don't think many students appreciate how important it is to future success. Do we have any research or resources available under that umbrella?
CCL has a tremendous number of white papers and a couple of researchers who work in this space of generational people stepping into the workplace. So, Michael, we can certainly look up and see what might be available, and glad to share those with you, resources that we might have. Nothing springs to mind. Does anything pop to mind to you, Preston?
Yeah, so expanding the leadership equation white paper might be a nice one, and that also ties back into somebody earlier that asked about how early does leadership development happen. So this was a study that was done with roughly 450, 500 professionals that were responding when they thought leadership development was important, why it was important, what attributes were important. So it kind of speaks a bit to that. There are also some really good employment surveys, from like college career employment organizations. Todd, you might be able to reference some of those more quickly in your mind than I am. But those often will look at what are the skills and capabilities that employers are looking for. But, I would say research sometimes is meaningful to students, but if we really get in the student's head, who do you know that has been on a student trajectory more recently than we have that could maybe visit and speak to that?
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Can somebody else come back in and speak about their experience as they've left? Somebody that's maybe 2 years out of school or something that looks and sounds a lot more like students are and can speak to that from personal experience.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. If we didn't get to your question, we can follow up with an email, and Michael will get you that white paper as well. So thank you, Todd and Preston, for sharing a leadership development framework for success in and out of the classroom. Tomorrow, everyone who attended will receive a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording and a white paper on the Higher Ed Student Leadership Development 5 Keys to Success Todd mentioned earlier. Regina, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to close it out, or if
And if
Todd
Jess wants to reach out to us on her question there, I know we didn't get time to get to it, but it's a pretty in-depth one, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to follow up with you offline.
And thank you all for being a part and joining with us today. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
All right, this was great. Thank you so much. This actually concludes today's webcast. Thank you all for attending. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with the link to the recording. And please visit our webinar event calendar at www.ccl.org. Thank you.